Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar, Parking Reform for Housing Production. This program is brought to you by Open Architecture Collaborative, the American Institute of Architects Housing and Community Development Knowledge Community, and EDI. I'm Kathy Dorgan. I'm your facilitator today. I'm joined behind the scenes by Linda Perez of EDI. We're very pleased today to have Dr. Richard Wilson. Dr. Wilson's a professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Cal Poly Pomona. Dr. Wilson's research addresses parking planning, land use transportation relationships, travel management, transit-oriented development, planning theory, and professional development. I'm sure after this presentation you will want to learn more about his many publications, including Parking Reform Made Easy, Parking Management, and his latest publication, A Guide for the Idealist. Our learning objectives today are fourfold. The first is to understand the context for minimum parking requirements. The second is to possess familiarity with the 12-step parking reform toolkit. The third is to know the impediments to parking reform. And finally, to be able to develop the ability to recommend parking management tools. The course, as you've learned prior to signing up, is to learn how to work with local jurisdictions in seeking revisions to minimum parking requirements for residential development. This webinar describes a 12-step toolkit for developing recommendations to reform or eliminate minimum parking requirements. It also reviews parking management methods that should apply to parking requirement reform. A little word about logistics. As shown on my screen, and perhaps behind the control panel on your screen, is a box where you can share questions you have. Submit a question as the program goes along, or if you have any technical questions, please type those in. Content-related questions will be addressed at the end of the program, and any technical issues will be addressed in writing as the program progresses. Just a reminder that this presentation is protected by US and international copyright laws. Reproduction, distribution, display, or use of the presentation without the written permission of the speaker is strictly prohibited. This program is provided by AIA Knowledge, which is a registered provider with the American Institute of Architects Continuing Education System. Credits earned on completion of this program will be reported to AIA for AIA members. Certificates of completion for both AIA members and non-members are available upon request. This program is registered with AIA for continuing professional education. It does not include content that may be deemed or construed to be approved or endorsed by the AIA of any material of construction or any method or manner of handling, using, distributing, or dealing with any material or product. Questions related to specific materials, methods, and services will be addressed following the conclusion of the presentation. This screen you're seeing now will appear again at the end of the presentation. It provides a link where you can take a survey about the program. That survey is necessary to secure credits and needs to report all attendees at your site. We'll also be suggesting that you may want to join the AIA Housing and Community Development Knowledge Community at this link. AIA membership is not necessary to be part of the community, but of course, we encourage you all to be AIA members. Also, we look forward to you following both the Open Architecture Collaborative and AIA Housing on social media. Thank you and welcome, Richard.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm often speaking to urban planners, zoning officials, and community groups, but I'm really delighted to be speaking to architects and designers and developers on this critical issue of parking. My focus here is parking reform for housing production, to examine the relationship between parking requirements and housing production, but primarily to help you interact with local officials if you find that parking requirements are out of sync with community goals to build housing and have sustainable transportation. So let's start broadly, and then I will zoom in on the particular issues related to housing. This is an aerial image of Ontario Mills Shopping Center, just east of Cal Poly Pomona, where I teach in Southern California. And here you can see the legacy of minimum parking requirements and single-use zoning, which has produced an environment in which buildings sit sort of as islands in a sea of parking around them. This is a practice that doesn't very efficiently use land and doesn't very efficiently use parking, because generally parking is not shared between uses. This kind of environment also is very automobile oriented, and it's difficult to serve it with transit, walking, biking, and so on, because it's really designed for the car. So single site peak use parking leads to significant walkability and land use challenges. This is what it's like on the ground. The lines are straight, the trees are healthy, but these spaces are rarely used except for the peak demand shopping period, perhaps in November, December. Here's another example where parking isn't dominating the landscape. Actually, this is a very nice, walkable, livable community. It's South Pasadena in Southern California. Parking is integrated into the urban form. There's still a substantial amount of it. But this is a case where parking requirements affect economic development. These are historic buildings, and I happen to know a property owner who was looking for a tenant, and restaurant wanted to go into their 1,000 square foot space, and in this city required 10 spaces for every 1,000 square feet of restaurant. And so no restaurant could locate in the district, even though that use made good sense. In this case, the city did review their requirements and revise them so that they could unlock the economic development potential in this district. So this place has fine-grained livability, but parking requirements were a roadblock to revitalization. And finally, this is Huntington Park, California, a residential area that was developed probably as single family and has densified. And as both additional units are constructed and as crowding occurs in housing, the on-street parking resources are tight. And so this produces significant issues, community issues related to parking supply. Unfortunately, some cities address this problem by raising parking requirements, which seemingly would provide more parking, but in fact may really be an impediment to housing production, and therefore make the housing affordability issues we face in California worse. So let me describe the general problem that I have identified, and others have as well. Often code requirements in city zoning codes set a requirement that is greater than the actual level of parking used. Now, this is not always the case, but often when you measure peak utilization in a project, it rarely reaches 85 or 90%. When we build too much parking, we have two effects on design, making places more convenient for automobile access and making places more difficult to serve with walking, cycling, and transit. When there's more parking supply than demand, the price is zero, so there's no real market for parking. So those who park do not experience the cost of land and construction to produce those spaces. And this system tends to lead to a structure in which market norms are adopted where a certain amount of parking is seen as an appropriate level that reduces risk of the project not being successful. So it's sort of a self-reinforcing loop that continues to favor the side of excess parking supply in many locations. And so I've been working to try and understand that loop and to get local decision makers to think differently about parking. So the major argument I'm making here is that parking is policy, and that may not sound like such a radical thing to say, but parking is often portrayed as a technical issue and an engineering issue, that there is in fact a correct amount of parking to provide. And in past practice, often cities look up a number in the Institute of Transportation Engineers Parking Generation Handbook, which is a series of national averages of parking occupancy, and say, well, that's the right number. Other cases, I've interviewed developers of office buildings and I've said, what's the right amount of parking? And they say 4 spaces for every 1,000 square feet of building area. And I say, how do you know that? And they say, it's the golden rule. So I don't think there is a golden rule for parking. It's a policy choice. The right amount of parking depends on community objectives related to everything from transportation modes to housing affordability to sustainability. So I think we should see parking requirements as a key policy issue that's in the middle of things that planners and designers and architects care about. Good design, avoiding sprawl, economic development, sustainability, and transportation systems that have a level of resilience. So my goal is to put parking requirements in their place. So let me say a little bit what I mean by in their place. If we think about transportation planning from the big picture and we back up, what its transportation is doing is providing connectivity, having people be able to get from home to work, from home to school, from home to shopping, and so on. So access between land uses is really the primary objective. And this diagram shows there's many ways to achieve that. You can achieve that with land use planning that brings mixed uses closer together. We are certainly seeing telecommunications substitute of physical travel. And then there, on the right, of course, is traditional movement physical travel. So the point of this diagram is to say that parking requirements are at the very bottom of this system to support a particular way of connecting land uses together, and that often this diagram is backwards. People start with parking rather than starting with the question about accessibility between land uses and asking creatively, what are the best ways to provide the connectivity that we seek? So if there's problems with parking requirements being excessive in many cases, why is that? Is it a habit? Do planners allow higher parking requirements to exist as a form of bargaining leverage to achieve other public amenities? Are we addicted to the parking requirements? What's the situation? So there are a lot of reasons why it is difficult to make changes, and these are some of them. Certainly, residents do not necessarily embrace changes to parking requirements because they seek to preserve the privileges they have, whether they're parking on the street, in front of their house, or somewhere else in the neighborhood. Local planners find parking a controversial issue. It's hard to bring up with community groups, and they find parking to be a relatively easy thing to require because it's clearly legal, and they may seek to leverage parking requirements for other public benefits. Public works departments and the police departments, they don't mind excessive parking supply because it lessens their job in dealing with on-street parking management and conflicts over that issue. In the development community, obviously developers are sensitive to the costs that parking creates for development, and also know that parking requirements can sometimes make individual sites very difficult to develop because of some aspect of their configuration. So one would expect a development community would lead the charge to reform parking requirements, but I note that if every developer is treated the same way, then they are less motivated to do that because the excess costs of parking are factored into the amount they're willing to pay for the land. So I do see significant interest on the part of ULI and other development communities to address this issue. But the way we've done it in the past, if everyone's treated the same, everyone has the same burden. And finally, groups that are opposed to developments of various kinds, not in my backyard groups, use parking concerns and anxiety about parking to challenge planning programs and to seek to limit density. In California, our environmental law, CEQA, used to have on its checklist whether or not there would be an impact on parking, which was rather ironic since it's an environmental law that was inadvertently avoiding any type of parking shortage and therefore making it easier to drive and have pollution and greenhouse gas emissions and so on. So there's a lot of reasons why this is hard to change, but the good news is change is happening. So my colleague Donald Shoup at UCLA has been working on this for 4 decades. I've been working on it for 3. And cities are reforming their minimum parking requirements. In Los Angeles, I'm on the zoning advisory committee, and we're recommending 0 parking requirements for the downtown area. Buffalo, New York recently eliminated parking requirements. Cities are looking at particular reforms in their communities. So there is change happening, but it's a challenge to address the concerns of all the stakeholders involved. So I want to make this webinar as directly helpful to you as I can. So that was my background introduction, but now I'd really like to present to you some information that will help you if you're working with local officials on parking issues in residential development. When I interview planners about parking requirements, I mentioned there are some national standards or books people refer to. The Institute of Transportation Engineers Parking Generation Handbook is one. The other thing that many planners told me is that the way they determined the parking requirement is they called around to the neighboring cities and asked them what their requirement was and merely copied it. And so if everybody is wrong and everybody's copying everybody, that makes no sense. So I'm really pushing for a more analytical approach to setting parking requirements. So that's what I'd like to present to you now. This is my 12-step process, and it's obviously a lot of steps, but the big picture point here is it is important to think through each of these steps in order to have a legitimate basis for claiming that a parking requirement should be X or Y. And so I'm really pushing for a more analytic approach to parking requirements. So I'd like to briefly go through each step and show you how it works. So the first issue is, if you're dealing with a project in a community, it is important to have local data on the existing level of parking occupancy. In other words, if it's residential, how many spaces are occupied per unit or per bedroom in typical developments in the community. it may be different than the level of parking occupancy nationwide, or even different than the neighboring community. So there's lots of ways to get this information. One can go out and count parking occupancy. You can use air photo interpretation as shown in this picture. But especially useful for housing is the American Community Survey, the census data study, has a question about vehicle availability, and it has it by rental households and ownership households. So at no cost, you can look up on the web, and if you're dealing with a community that over parking requirements, you can find out what the actual level of vehicle availability per household is. And if it's 1.4 and the city is wanting 2.5 spaces for every unit, there's something out of whack, and you can make a evidence-based argument to the community about reconsidering that. Of course, if everybody is getting free parking, the level of parking vehicle availability observed may be higher than if they had to pay for it. And so that's another issue that I'll come to in a minute. But the level of parking occupancy measured reflects a legacy of oversupply of parking and free parking. The second step is to think about the future. And it's ironic that urban planners are writing comprehensive plans, thinking 20, 30 years into the future, but often parking uses data looking backwards into the past. So that reference guide, the ITE reference guide I mentioned, has data in it from the 1980s and the 1990s. And so we should be thinking about how much parking is going to be needed in the future if a building is going to last 50 or 100 years. And so I've been inventorying the various trends and issues that affect future parking occupancy, future vehicle ownership, and most of them suggest a lower rate, for residential, for example, fewer parking spaces occupied per unit in the future. The only one that is going the other way is changes in intensity of occupancy. And so, for example, if there's housing crowding, more people per unit, there'll be more parking demand. And in the area of office buildings, new office arrangements also produce higher parking demand per square foot. But generally, it's going in the direction of reduction. And this slide I pulled out of The Economist recently. With autonomous vehicles, shared mobility, multimodal transportation, it is likely that the level of private vehicle ownership will decline significantly in the future, which means less parking, and particularly less parking in residential projects. So I work with developers now who are building projects and they have parking, but they're thinking ahead to provide bicycle parking, zip car parking, loading, unloading areas on the curb for shared mobility services. And they're also thinking about, is the parking I'm building, can the parking I'm building be converted to another use? Should in 2035, for example, the level of ownership of cars in this residential development be 50% lower than it is today? So we don't know exactly how fast these trends are going to play, but it is a very significant factor that designers and their developer clients should think about in terms of the lifespan of the project. This third step here is a very nerdy in the weeds issue, but in the past, parking requirements, if you had 100 studies of parking occupancy, often the parking requirement would be based on the 85th percentile occupancy, meaning that they're setting the parking requirements so 15% of the cases would not have enough and 85% would have too much. Another way to do, of course, is to base it on the average occupancy of the studies you measure. So this is a kind of a technical step, but it's significant because it reflects how nervous you are about having a single project that would not have enough parking. And that's a major concern, source of anxiety that tends to jack up the amount of parking required, so no projects will encounter that situation. Later in the presentation, I'll discuss with you a little bit about parking management, and there are a lot of very effective tools that you can use for that 1 in 10 or 2 in 10 projects that have a very high level of parking occupancy. You also have to consider the project and the context for the project. So this chart here is an example showing how significantly vehicles available per unit varies between owner-occupied and renter-occupied housing, and how it varies across geographic space. This happens to show the counties in the New York region. And so this makes it clear there cannot be a correct parking requirement for housing development in the US or even in a state, because it varies significantly by the type of housing. The next step is to think about whether people have to pay for parking. So in multifamily residential developments, the tradition is when you rent an apartment, you get a certain number of units assigned to you, and you don't pay for them separately than your rent. So that's what we call bundling, that they're bundled, the cost of parking is bundled with the rent. Many developers and communities are experimenting with unbundling, with the idea that people who don't have a car and don't park deserve lower rent. They shouldn't pay a higher rent to cover the cost of parking that they don't use. And when a household has to pay for parking separately, it changes their thinking about, well, do I really need 1 or 2 or 3 cars? And have I explored other modes of transportation and that kind of thing? So unbundling parking is a very promising idea that would mean less parking occupancy when people have to pay for the parking. That's not traditionally how rental housing works, or even condominiums in multifamily, but an example of how this is happening in a step-by-step way is developer or property owner might offer 1 free space per unit, but then if the household wanted an extra parking space, they would pay $75 a month or something like that. So generally, as the studies show, that as people have to pay for parking, they consume less of it. Another critical factor is what's happening with plans for transit, pedestrian facilities, and bike facilities. In my city of Los Angeles, the county's invested about $10 billion on rail transit. We're doing complete street programs. We have bike share, all sorts of efforts to improve other modes of transportation. And to the extent that those are successful, they may reduce the use of automobiles, and ultimately, if one can get to many destinations without driving, one might reduce household vehicle ownership. A 7th step is how efficiently are the spaces used? And so a tradition in multifamily residential housing is that you are assigned a space for your unit, which is desirable for the resident because their space is always there and they know where it is. But it's inefficient in the sense that if one resident is out of town or at work at night or at work during the day, another resident cannot use that space. So the most desirable situation from a parking efficiency standpoint is to not assign spaces. That's probably a thing to be figured out market area by market area. But if you do assign spaces, you need more of them because you can't use them with the same degree of efficiency. Another thing to consider is off-site parking. It may be that there are parking resources right next to I worked in a project in Oxnard where it was a kind of new urbanist community, and there was concerns there wasn't enough residential parking. And right across the street was an office development with a large supply of surface parking. The office development needs that parking during the day, obviously, but not generally at night and on weekends. And that's when the residential parking demand is the highest. So it is possible that in some land use context, the project residents could use some adjacent parking, thereby allowing less on-site parking to be constructed. Shared parking is a principle I just previewed with you, but the idea that two uses that have different peak demand periods could share parking. So there are obviously in residential development, most people want to have the residential parking to be exclusive. So in some mixed-use developments, there's actually a physical barrier between the residential parking and the retail parking. But to the extent that could be reduced, it's more efficient. And also a halfway point example would be that the visitor parking for the residential use would be shared with the commercial use. So thinking about ways of sharing works when there's different peak occupancy periods for each use. And so if the example of an office building, if people are not there at night and some residents go to work every weekday and only need a space at night, that's a perfect sharing opportunity. So I know this is a lot of steps, but my point is to just slow down instead of jumping what's the parking requirement, and let's look at our neighbor and choose that. To say analytically, I'm going to consider these 9 steps and what are the conditions in my community and what does that suggest about a possible parking requirement. At the beginning, I mentioned that parking is a policy choice. So step 10 says this process of considering factors that affect parking requirements you may well want to iterate it and then ask, does this rate we've come up with support community goals? So just as an example, if the community goal was we have a real housing affordability issue and we need to increase housing supply, then reducing parking requirements would be helpful to making that happen. In California, legislator recently proposed SB 827, which would actually override local government zoning around transit-rich transit stops and prohibit the local jurisdiction from imposing minimum parking requirements and certain density and height limitations. This is obviously controversial because the tradition of home rule authority over zoning is very strong, but in California, the state is saying we have such a big problem with housing affordability and production that we are considering taking away that authority from local government. So that's an example of showing how important the housing issue is right now in many parts of the country. Okay, 2 more steps, and then we're done our 12 steps. One issue is space size. If smaller space sizes can be used, that will allow more efficient use of land or building area devoted to parking. And many communities are considering smaller size spaces. I think in residential units, smaller size spaces could be considered because residents usually know where their space is and they know how to maneuver into them. For example, if you had a variety store where there's 10 people per hour using that space, that would call for maybe a larger space size so that maneuvering can be convenient. The other issue with space size, of course, is if soon we will have self-parking cars, they will be able to park themselves closer together because you may come to the front of your residential building, get out of the car, and the car will go into the parking structure and park itself. So you don't need as much room for doors swinging open. And self-driving cars could also perhaps stack themselves in aisleways, making the amount of land needed to be devoted for parking significantly less. Finally, in residential uses, tandem parking is a very efficient way of providing 2 spaces per unit when that's required. Residents and city officials generally don't like tandem parking because there's an issue of the level convenience. Member of the household with the car in the garage has to move the other car, but it saves land on aisleways, so it really offers quite good efficiency potentials, and I think it's a way to go in that regard. So this is a diagram just showing hypothetically working through these 12 steps. So the idea is you start with some data from the community about parking use, you make adjustments for the future, make decisions about the basis for the rate, make adjustments for transit plans, and with this chart you could present to a local planner or a planning commission or a city council and say, here's how we got this recommendation that you should reform your minimum parking requirements. This is set up as a per unit basis. As you know, many parking requirements for residential are distinguished between studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms. So there's a way in the book that shows how to break that back down into unit mix. So I'm going to quickly go because we're going to finish at about 9:45 so I can answer your questions. But what's happening in the US in terms of this reform that I'm speaking of? So the traditional approach is that parking requirements are higher than the actual level of use. So a moderate reform is to make them more closely tied to the real level of use. Some big cities are lowering their requirements below the expected utilization and just leaving it up to the developer to decide whether to build more than the minimum. And some cities, as I mentioned, are deregulating in parts of the city or all of the city and moving from ultimately requiring parking to require the development to show that accessibility is provided for in a broader way, a broader set of ways than just parking and driving. So I have two sets of a set of priorities here for things you might work on in terms of parking reform, starting with the easier things and going to the harder things. The first thing is to either allow on-street parking to be counted as meeting the city's visitor parking requirement if the code requires it. And the second is to eliminate the visitor parking requirement and just consider it to be part of the shared parking pool of the district in which the project's located. I think it's worth pushing for unbundling of the parking costs from the rent or the purchase price. And then seeking to lower minimums to expected vehicle availability. If more is possible, then lowering the minimums to below the expected vehicle availability, which leaves it to the developer and the designer to decide in that market area, is it economically worth it to provide the code, the lower code, or a greater amount, and will that pay off in terms of project lease up and rents? And finally, the last step would be to eliminate minimum requirements. Now, these ideas make residents very nervous and elected officials nervous. So it's important to have other things to combine with this to help people understand how the system could work. So for example, many multifamily residential developers are giving free transit passes to residents for a defined period to encourage transit use. They're providing spaces for temporary car rental, shared mobility pickup. They're providing bicycle parking. One idea is in Berkeley, developer wanted to build less parking than the city wanted by code, and they agreed to an agreement where the developer would build less parking, but in a way that they could add mechanical parking later if it turned out the parking demand was higher than they anticipated. So that's an interesting way of avoiding an upfront capital cost, but giving the city some assurance that their needs will be met if they materialize in the future. Some developers are offering preferential rentals for those employed locally. I worked on a project in Hawthorne where SpaceX is right across the street, so that SpaceX employees are going to get a first right rental preference. And finally, providing all sorts of pedestrian improvements and bike facilities. Parking requirements have all sorts of other bells and whistles. It's ironic, we force developer to build parking and then we try and tame it to reduce its impact, such as driveway regulations and so on. I'm not can answer any of these in questions if there are some. And there's lots of variations on supply regulations. So I wrote my first book, Parking Reform Made Easy, in 2013, and I presented it to public officials, and many of them said, and planners said, we understand your argument, but if we propose this, members of residential communities and other districts will come in and say, there's going to be parking demand spilled all over my neighborhood, in my district, poaching parking in my parking lot. What are you going to do about that? So it made me realize that parking management has to go along with parking supply reform. And so this includes things like time limits, space designations, a lot of work with pricing parking, on-street parking, for example. Dynamic pricing is where you vary the price by location, time period, and level of demand. And so San Francisco, Washington, D.C., LA are all doing experiments in dynamic parking pricing. So I will flip through this quickly so I can get finished, but I'm happy to come back and answer any questions about parking management. The final issue is politics and participation. So it's how do you engage stakeholders in thinking about these questions? One idea I think is very powerful is to link the reform of parking to broader community goals and plans. Just taking parking reform by itself is not particularly appealing to people. I certainly try to educate people about the consequences of the systems we have now and reform, but I do note that not everyone wants to be educated about parking. So I think actually appealing to self-interest and attracting allies are powerful strategies. Appealing to self-interest, particularly with related to housing, is showing local leaders how housing supply could be enhanced by reforming parking requirements. Here's a couple attempts at education, a graphic that shows the reality of how much area is devoted to parking for a 2-bedroom apartment under various parking requirements. People are sometimes shocked to realize how much that is. King County, Seattle County around Seattle has a very innovative multifamily residential parking calculator that helps people think about how parking demand will vary by location within the Seattle region. And that's a very interesting tool you can check out. And also there's organizations that are developing kind of equivalent to LEED for green transportation, where a developer would certify their strategies to reduce vehicle trips with this organization and then be able to market the project as having a green trip certification. So if Joni Mitchell and Bob Dylan wrote a song together, it would be entitled Paved Paradise Revisited. It's time to reform minimum parking requirements. This final slide shows a link to the 2 books I have. I encourage you to check them out. And I think now we're going to switch to questions and answers.
Thank you very much. That was a terrific program. and it's particularly useful to me. I'm working on a project where we're having a big discussion about the parking demand and how much of the space should be spent on parking, and I'm going to definitely share your program with the board of directors of the housing authority I'm working with. We have several questions here. One of the participants commented, the common mentality in our city seems to be that street parking in front of single-family residences and even lots in front of small-scale commercial belong to the fronting property rather than the public. This discourages new, larger-scale residential that might use street parking or flex parking at nearby commercial. Do you have any suggestions for that participants' community conversations?
Sure, that's such a common situation. I encounter it pretty much in every project I work in. So residents believe they sort of own that parking space in front of their house or in front of their store. I mean, in fact, of course, they don't. It's public right of way. But it's a very hard battle to take on just to tell them that they're wrong. So innovative communities are, I mentioned self-interest in one of my slides. The idea, for example, in Boulder had a neighborhood where office buildings were on the edge of a residential neighborhood, and the residents wanted a permit parking program to keep the office workers from parking in their neighborhood. And what the city did instead was say, what if we sold a limited number of parking permits to those workers to park in the neighborhood, and we returned a chunk of the revenue to you to use for street tree trimming, wow, sidewalk repair. So making it so that there's something in it for them. The equivalent in commercial areas is a parking benefit district. In Old Pasadena, that was one of the first districts to do this. Normally when you tell the merchants we'd like to charge for parking and have meters and pricing, they say, well, that will kill business and I don't want it. But when the merchants are told you get a share of the parking revenue in return from the meters, they look at it completely differently, and they were open to it. So I think there's got to be something in it for the local community, because their default answer is going to be, no, we were here first, kind of squatters' right perspective. We're going to fight any attempts to allow others to park in front of my house or in front of my store.
Oh, those are great ideas. Thank you. We have several inquiries that I'm conflating here for one. Can you tell us more about project-based car sharing being used to reduce parking requirements? So where vendors like Zipcar can be used at tenants of the same property or in a community setting, and specifically any examples of where that's been done?
Yeah, that project I mentioned I was working on in Hawthorne is an example that's going to do that. So one issue is allocating spaces within the parking facility for a Zipcar or other vendor. So providing them space and then marketing it along with the project orientation material that tenants see. And people have been studying how many spaces one Zipcar space could replace. And it obviously varies by market area and by all that context factors that I said, but some people have found that one Zipcar space can replace between 4 and 8 spaces devoted to particular users. So it is a really promising element of efficiency. The other issue is the Zipcar space doesn't have to be in the development either. In many urban communities, people walk half a block to access that transportation service. So it's a slow process of residents realizing they can reduce their car ownership with a portfolio of transportation options. And this is the biggest change that's happened in transportation in the last decade. We used to think of transportation as being, you are a bus rider, you own a vehicle, and you drive, and you use one mode of transportation every day the same way. And what we're seeing in urban areas is this new portfolio of accessibility options where someone might take transit one day, use Uber and Lyft because it's raining and they're running late, ride their bike another day. So this idea of a palette of transportation access options is part of where that Zipcar idea fits in. But I think it's just a matter of getting them involved in the project, dedicating spaces to them, and then marketing the availability as tenants consider the project.
Great. Really helpful. There's a question here about the conversation you had about space requirements for parking. And that's really interesting to a lot of us. Can you talk a little bit about size requirements that you recommend in turning radiuses, et cetera, and good sources of that information and support?
Yeah. Example, I worked on a project in the city of Riverside where the developer was going to meet the code, but the site configuration, it was one level of underground parking, meant that drive aisles had to be a little bit narrower than is traditional. So backing up a step, many cities adopted a compact parking allowance in their code. So if a traditional space was 8.5 feet wide, you could have a certain percentage of spaces being 7.5 feet wide. And generally had a bad experience with it, where a large vehicle would park in a small space and block a couple other spaces and so on. So it seems the trend is to a unispace, a smaller space size for all spaces in the facility. And that might be moving from 8.5 feet wide spaces to 8 feet, or it might be a somewhat more narrow drive aisle. Obviously, you have to do the studies of turning radius and making sure that the facility works. But I do think there's a relationship here with parking management as well. In that project in Riverside, one member of the city council said, well, I own a large pickup truck and I could never get in there. And before I could answer, his fellow city council members said, you're not going to live there, Bob, because it was an infill project and in downtown Riverside. It wasn't the place where someone with a large pickup truck would live generally. So the idea that residential project managers manage the vehicle parking arrangements of their tenants as they rent up the facility would allow smaller size spaces. So rather than having large spaces in case someone has a large vehicle, finding a better management tool to direct larger vehicles either to larger spaces within the facility or somewhere else in the district, so that you can save land and building area for most cases where vehicle size is smaller.
I'm fascinated by this idea that parking management is part of the solution on parking. And I wonder, we talk about that a lot in energy savings, that resident education is important. And I wonder if you can share with us some examples of resident education that have been successful in the parking arena.
Yeah, well, I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the commercial for the rotisserie cooker. There was a chicken rotisserie cooker, and it was the first infomercial, and the guy put the chicken in the thing, and the crowd said, set it and forget it. And set it and forget it is the way we approach parking. The city says, I'm setting it by giving you a minimum parking requirement, and then I don't want to manage it. I want to be done with that. So anyway, we're moving from set it to forget it to more. So the move in parking management parallels, as you said, energy systems and many other realms where we're actively managing the use of a resource. I think, honestly, there's a resident education aspect to it, especially as people sort out the units they might choose to rent or not rent or buy or not buy. But I actually think it's more in the area of parking, making choices and setting prices and rules so that people can figure out what makes sense for them, but making sure that those who use a lot of parking experience the costs they create in development costs of building that parking. So, I know in energy systems, feedback loops that help people see how much energy they're saving. Maybe we could do that in a parking garage. I hadn't really thought about that. But you could have a monitor in the lobby that had greenhouse gas emissions from travel associated with residents of the project as an awareness building idea.
Interesting. We have a question here about whether a recording of this webinar will be available. And yes, it will be posted along with the other programs from the AIA and the Open Architecture Network. And our final question for the speaker is, I was fascinated by your discussions of the future of self-driving cars. Are there any other things that you think we should be looking at in the future for parking?
Well, I think, yes, the further integration of real-time management and information. So Europe's ahead of us on this, but the idea of you placing a destination in your navigation system and it delivering you on the streets and then delivering you to the space that it knows is available in the facility, and that it charges you without any need for gate arms or parking attendants or anything like that. So that is very close, and I think it will improve the efficiency with which we use parking. We can get to a point where we don't have people circulating parking structures or parking lots unsuccessfully looking for spaces, which is creating distracted drivers, extra vehicle miles traveled, extra pollution, and so on. So the full integration of information into parking management is coming. It's here now, and it's going to get more in the future.
Great. Well, I want to thank you again for a really wonderful presentation. This is really helpful, I think, to all of us and to our communities. I want to remind participants on the program that if you are looking for AIA or other credit, you should report your attendance by completing the survey by this Friday. You can do that by the link you see on your screen here, or an email that you'll receive in the mail within the next hour. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Wilson. This was a great program.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us.